So hello and thanks for attending our club luncheon. I'd like to again mention our club luncheon sponsor, Albrecht & Albrecht law firm, has been supporting this luncheon for several years now. So if you need legal help, please think about calling Albrecht & Albrecht. The goal of the club is club luncheon. The goal of the club is to bring together all Democrats, from the most conservative to the most progressive, to celebrate our shared values, appreciate who we are, and to work together to put more Democrats in office. So our program today will feature Drew Cooper discussing the Rural Utah Project. Everyone is asked to stay muted except for the speaker, myself, and Kathy Devine and Karen Pontius, who will be handling questions. And if you want to submit a question during the luncheon, please use the chat feature on Zoom. Please do not unmute yourself and speak. Send your questions to everyone in the chat window. So make sure that little drop down says everyone. If you're having trouble with your internet connectivity, you may want to disable your video. Audio only works better on slow connections. The Zoom meeting is being recorded and should be available within a day or so for viewing. You can choose speaker mode, typically in the upper right corner, which will bring up a larger video of the person speaking. And while the La Plata Dems are okay on funds for right now, some of our biggest fundraisers have had to be canceled due to the pandemic. So I would encourage everyone to donate to the party. Monthly donations are particularly appreciated, and you can set those up on ActBlue. Monthly donations make it easy for you to give to the party with relatively little pain. I think we're ready to announce our picnic, Dems picnic on August the 29th, if I remember right. So if Karen, if you've got some information on that, why don't you drop that into the chat window, and maybe at the end you can talk about that for a little bit. This is the 6th club luncheon for 2021, and the club luncheon committee has been working to bring some great programs for this year, and I think you'll really enjoy them. Next month, Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser will be with us, and we're also considering when we might be able to do these luncheons in person again. That's turning out to be more difficult than we thought it was going to be, but we'll keep trying. If anyone has any other announcements to make, please enter something in the chat window, and we'll recognize you at the end of the luncheon. So I'm going to introduce Maya Kane. She is a member of the La Plata County Democrats Executive Committee, and she's going to introduce our speaker, Drew Cooper. So let's give a big virtual welcome to Maya. So go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Hope you all can hear me okay. I'm really thrilled to be involved as a new executive committee member of the La Plata Democrats, and I'm even more thrilled to be able to introduce the Rural Utah Project and their incredible work, especially over in San Juan County, to this organization. I know that this crowd does not need to be persuaded that the right to vote is absolutely fundamental to our American democracy. John Lewis called it the most important and powerful nonviolent tool that we have in our democracy, and it's under threat now more than ever. It must be guarded, protected, promoted, and unfortunately litigated. It's through litigation that I first got connected with Drew Cooper and the folks at the Rural Utah Project. I was involved in a 7-year battle over voting rights on behalf of the Navajo Nation in San Juan County, where we litigated election districts that disenfranchised Navajo voters, despite the fact that they were the majority of the county's population. They were never able to represent a majority of the county commission. In the midst of that, we ended up partnering with the ACLU and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to litigate over the closure of polling locations across the Navajo reservation in the Utah Strip. And then eventually we had to get involved to step in to protect a candidate who was a Navajo candidate who was trying to get on the ballot to run for county commission, and the county clerk and recorder was erecting, insurmountable obstacles to that. So, that was a real eye-opening experience for me in terms of, what it looks like to truly disenfranchise voters on the ground, everything from vote dilution to just complete voter suppression. And that's, our litigation took more than 7 years. We eventually prevailed in the 10th Circuit. New election districts were redrawn. But what I didn't really appreciate at the time is that you can win in the courtroom, but that victory is only as powerful as it is able to be translated to the population it affects. You can redraw an election district, but if people don't know that their vote actually can count after years and years of having it be diluted to the point where it really doesn't matter, then that vote is ultimately meaningless. And that's where I think this organization, the Rural Utah Project in particular, is so incredibly effective at protecting some of the most disenfranchised voters that we have. And this is right next door to La Plata County. I mean, it's remarkable, the stark differences. You know, the other thing I learned through that process is how seemingly innocuous provisions of state law can translate into immensely disparate impacts for disenfranchised voters. For example, whether or not postage is included on a mail-in ballot, and the amount of time between when that ballot is dropped in the mail and when people receive it can be vastly different based on where you live. So to that end, this organization is focused on some of the most fundamental protections of that most fundamental right. And I'm really thrilled to hear more about their incredible work in San Juan County and throughout rural Utah. And now I have the honor of introducing Drew Cooper, who was born and raised in a small rural Iowa town, but has been happy to call Bluff, Utah his home for nearly 3 years. Since 2014, he's worked on campaigns to increase civic engagement and get out the vote in Iowa, Virginia, and Utah. In 2018, he moved to Southern Utah and began working for the Rural Utah Project, which is a nonprofit that works to break down barriers to civic engagement, lift up voices of disenfranchised groups across Southern Utah, and fight for progressive change. Drew spends most of his time working with the Rural Utah Project's partners, overseeing voter registration and issue advocacy programs across Southern Utah. So thank you, Drew, so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Maya. And I had talked on the phone with Maya before this number of years ago in that period of litigation she referenced, but it's so good to actually get to meet you, and it's really good to be here with you all. I am thrilled to see how organized you all are, and this is such a great opportunity to spread the word about and connect with folks who are in our region. I'd like to think of us and the work that we do as being work that's relevant across state lines and across county lines, and so I love doing events like this where we get a chance to connect with folks who are so near and so close to the issues we're going to talk about today. Maya really did a great job teeing up a lot of these issues. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. There might be a little recap, and also I should say that Maya is a lawyer, so I'm going to defer any questions that folks have about any legal matters probably back to Maya at the end of the presentation. But today, I want to really just use this time, and I see Rose Chilcote's on the meet. I know that there are a lot of folks on this meeting who have a lot of a really amazing, much more background and insight into the politics and the political history of San Juan County than I do. So I might not do this justice, but today I want to give you some context for the political dynamics in San Juan County, and also talk a lot about, a kind of historic momentous shift that occurred in the power dynamic here in 2018, and some of the work that Rural Utah Project that we're working on and have taken up since the 2018 elections. Maya kind of gave a background on RUP, but we're a 501c4. We actually also have a 501c3 wing to our organization now. Of 11 full-time staff, 4 of us live in San Juan County, and 3 of us are members of the Navajo Nation. We mostly receive support from individuals in Utah and foundations based in Utah. And we have an organizing presence across 6 counties in southern and southeastern Utah. Granted, a majority of our programming historically has focused on San Juan County. So let's talk about San Juan County. Here's a nice county map of Utah just to kind of get you geographically oriented. It's the furthest southeastern county in Utah. It's the confluence of the Green and the Colorado River, and the Colorado River makes up the western boundary. It flows from, or the county boundaries itself start from the valley that Moab sits in, Spanish Valley on the far northern edge, and the La Salle Mountains on the northern edge of the county, all the way down to the Arizona border and all the way west to Lake Powell. It's the largest geographic county in Utah. Also home to some of the most stunning landscapes in Utah. Of course, I'm biased, but I think a lot of us on the call have been here and have seen some of the amazing canyon country that makes up San Juan County. And of course, it's home to Bears Ears National Monument. which was designated by President Obama in 2016 and illegally downsized by President Trump shortly thereafter. And I can show you some more pictures of Bears Ears here. But of course, it's also home to people and has been home to Indigenous people since time immemorial. Specifically, there are 2 federally recognized tribes whose reservation boundaries fall within San Juan County, the Navajo Nation and the Ute Mountain Ute Nation, the White Mesa Community Reservation of the Ute Mountain Ute Nation. And you can see that the county is fairly racially divided between the north and the south. The pink blocks here represent census blocks that are mostly white, and the purple represents census blocks that are mostly native. So you can see that the southern edge of the county is primarily native and the northern edge of the county is primarily white. And this is going to be important when we talk a little bit more about some of the historical voter disenfranchisement patterns and practices in the county. Give you a little sense of some of the timeline here. Maya referenced some litigation, but as we talked about, Bears Ears National Monument, which is the first national monument in the United States that written into the monument designation, is a tribal co-management policy. And this monument came about after years of organizing by Indigenous people from in San Juan County and beyond. And achieving that designation was a really historic moment, but it also was a really politically fraught issue here in San Juan County. And of course, we know that public lands and conflict over public lands characterizes a lot of politics in our region. And so, of course, it was very disappointing when Trump slashed the size of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, but particularly Bears Ears here in San Juan County in 2017. But right around that same time was when a federal court ordered a redrawing of voting district maps here in San Juan County. We talked about, you saw on the map that the San Juan County is kind of racially divided between the north and the south. And historically, the county commission, the 3 county commission districts were drawn in such a way to basically guarantee that only one Native American would be elected to the 3-member county commission. After a long period of litigation brought by the Navajo Nation and the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission in 2017, right after the monument was slashed, a federal court redrew these districts, and for the first time ever, really created 2 districts that gave Native Americans a chance to elect 2 candidates of their choice to the 3-member body. This is a pretty good map that illustrates those old districts, those old voting districts, and the new voting districts. We're obviously in a period of redistricting across the nation here following the census. And this is just a typical kind of textbook example of packing, where you take a majority population in the county, in this case, Native Americans comprising the majority of San Juan County, and you draw a district in such a way to basically pack as many of that population, as many of those people into the district as possible, and then divide up the remaining minority population between the other 2, creating a racial gerrymander that essentially existed to ensure that two Anglos, 2 white people would be elected and only 1 Native would have an opportunity. And as you can see, the new voting districts changed that dynamic, and it created 2 voting districts that were majority Native, and only 1 voting district remained that was majority white. You can see that when we look this population map here in District 2, on the right-hand side of your screen shows that total population percentage that is Navajo, and I think actually this map meant to say Native and not just Navajo. But when you look at the number of eligible voters, so population over the age of 18, you can see that District 2 is just barely what they would refer to as a minority opportunity district, meaning that minority, when you look at the minority, in this case, Native population, voting age population, it's not quite as that 65% number, it's closer to 52%. Native American voting age population. And just because the court redrew these districts did not guarantee a Native American would be elected out of that district, of course. And a big reason for that was despite the census showing that there was a Native American voting age population majority in Commission District 2, you can see here this graph kind of estimates or approximates the registration gap between essentially the total number of registered Native American voters in the district versus the census total voting age population estimation. So you can see that Native Americans really, there was quite a large gap between the red bar there and the green bar. There were quite a few unregistered Native Americans in the district, and that of course wasn't by accident. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the voter suppression tactics that have historically characterized the county, how San Juan counties run elections. But this was kind of Rural Utah Project's impetus. This is what was our call to action to get to work and register voters. So our staff, some of whom, Daleen Redhorse pictured here on the left, and Tara Benali pictured on the upper right-hand side of your screen, doing voter registration in probably the most beautiful place on earth to do voter registration in Monument Valley. We used a variety of different tactics to register voters. A lot of it was just, good old fashioned going door to door, knocking on doors, checking to make sure people were registered. We did site-based voter registration. We set up at events. We set up at fairs. We set up booths everywhere we could. And we actually also registered folks by mail. We sent out voter registration forms in the mail to get folks to register after they check their PO box. And our registration work paid off in the sense that we registered about 1,600 voters. We estimated that about 900 of them were entirely new voters. And you can see that a vast majority of the folks that we registered were in Commission District 2, which if there was going to be a Native American majority on the commission, it really would come down to that Commission District 2. We knew that was also the district that had the largest voter registration gap. So you can see that we registered folks of all parties. Historically, Navajo folks tend to vote Democrat, and you can see that the registration statistics kind of bear that out. And we also had kind of a fairly equal age distribution, skewing a little older. And I think that that's in large part because a lot of younger folks will leave the county to pursue job opportunities or school. And so a lot of the folks who are living here tend to be slightly older. This quote, I think, characterizes the next section of my presentation, which is my least favorite to give, which is to talk about some of the really intense voter suppression tactics that we saw used in 2018. It's really important to acknowledge that Navajo folks across the Navajo Nation have been fighting voter suppression for years and years. And there's a lot of amazing leaders on the Navajo Nation who have very, very successfully fought a lot of voter suppression tactics historically. Just in San Juan County alone, there's an awful history of overt voter suppression. Utah and New Mexico and Arizona were some of the last states to give Native people the right to vote in the United States. It took until the 50s and then really, of course, until the Voting Rights Act to actually get ballot access if you were a Native person in the county. There was also in the 70s and 1972 an example of two Navajo men who went to try to file for candidacy for commission and were actually intentionally given the wrong filing papers and disqualified from the ballot, which resulted in separate litigation. And in 1984, the U.S. Justice Department had to come in and file a Voting Rights Act lawsuit against the county to force the county to actually draw commission districts as opposed to just holding at-large elections. So there's a long history just in San Juan County, Utah, of intentional voter discrimination and voter suppression tactics. But we actually saw fairly recently in 2014, the county went to an only in-person voting, or excuse me, in 2014, the only in-person voting location in the county was located in Monticello. We generally like vote by mail across Utah, and I think Colorado uses vote by mail fairly successfully. And a lot of counties in Utah actually only conduct elections by mail now, leaving the only place where you can vote in person to the courthouse, the county clerk's office, or the election official's office. In San Juan County, Utah, though, that's essentially the equivalent of suppressing the vote and disenfranchising a huge number of Navajo voters, since access to mail delivery services at homes is non-existent. You have to drive to a PO box that can be 30, 40 minutes away one way from your house just to get mail. And then, of course, that doesn't even acknowledge the language access issue that it creates, where Navajo, which is a primarily spoken language, folks rely on polling locations to provide interpretation services to actually interpret and understand the ballot. And so when the county moved to all by mail voting, it really essentially disenfranchised and cut off ballot access to a huge number of Navajo voters. Maya referenced earlier that the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission and others worked to bring a lawsuit to require the county to provide in-person voting locations and also early voting locations so that folks who might not be able to get out on election day itself would have a chance to vote early. And unfortunately, that litigation was successful, resulted in a settlement agreement, and the county, since in 2018, under that settlement agreement, opened 3 early in-person voting locations on the Navajo Nation on election day and for early voting. We saw even at these early voting locations some pretty serious issues, though. In the primary election in 2018, a report that the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission compiled found some pretty huge issues on these polling locations on the reservation. We saw in Monument Valley, there was actually the polling location, because of technological issues and a lack of internet access, which is, typical kind of across southern part of San Juan County, and definitely for a foreseeable issue. They were unable to produce ballots. We saw in the Montezuma Creek location, and I know a lot of you probably have driven through Montezuma Creek on your way to some of the public lands here in San Juan County. The polling location actually didn't have lights. There was no power. The county clerk's office failed to kind of do a walkthrough adequately. So there was no air conditioning, no lights, which for older folks trying to fill out a ballot was really difficult. They actually ran out of paper to print ballots on at one point and had to borrow paper, or steal paper, I guess, from the fire department in Montezuma Creek. It was really kind of a difficult election to end. Fortunately, things got a little better for the general election, and we didn't see a repeat of some of these issues. But it kind of goes to show just how, even in just the kind of negligence of election administration really can serve as a voter suppression tactic or as a voter suppression tool and impact Navajo voters disproportionately. The other main issue I want to talk about is something that RUP has really focused on in the years since the 2018 elections. But as we were conducting voter registration across the Navajo Nation in Utah, we ran into what anybody doing voter registration anywhere on the Navajo Nation runs into, which is the lack of street addresses. A lot of us take street addresses for granted, and of course, street addresses serve a huge role in a lot of things outside of the voting context. But just since we're focusing on voter suppression and some historical barriers to accessing the ballot box in San Juan County, I want to contextualize this in the context of elections. But essentially, there's basically nowhere on the Navajo Nation in Utah that has street addresses, or what we think of as conventional street addresses. So as we registered voters in 2018, we saw, I put up some examples here of addresses, kind of descriptive street addresses that folks would use to describe the general location of their house. a lot of times these suffice pretty well, and frankly, a lot of folks have gotten really good at describing their house location pretty precisely using this sort of descriptive style address. Unfortunately, as the county conducted voter registration in the years leading up to the litigation regarding the voting districts, the county commission and school board districts, they had registered voters and they didn't record their actual descriptive address in the voter file. When you go and register to vote, the county elections officials will put your information into a big database, and instead of putting the descriptive addresses into that database, the previous county clerks in San Juan County used the tactic essentially of combining a person's PO box number with the precinct that the county elections official believed that person lived in at the time of registration, the old voting precinct. And there's actually not a digital map of these old voting precincts that exists. I didn't include it in the presentation, but prior to the voting rights litigation that resulted in the new commission districts, we essentially operated with precincts that were drawn using rulers as a grid almost. They were just perfect squares that didn't take into account natural geographic boundaries. They didn't really take into account equal populations. They really kind of didn't make a lot of sense. So of course the court in implementing new voting districts ended up drawing new precincts that did take into account a lot of the traditional districting principles that we think about when we do redistricting. Unfortunately though, a lot of those new voting precincts naturally ended up bisecting old voting precincts. And when voters were placed into these old voting precincts, all that could be ascertained was that they lived somewhere within that square. So if you imagine that square bisected by a new voting precinct, you don't know what side of the square the person lives on. This resulted in a pretty large issue of voters being placed or not able to be placed into the correct voting districts after these new precinct maps were implemented after the court decision. We partnered with the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission on kind of an informal survey of individual voters, and we found that you can kind of see some of the results here that we sampled about 681 Navajo voters across the Utah side of Navajo Nation. We found out that at least 127 of those voters, or about 18.6% of them, were placed in the wrong voting precinct. That was especially problematic because in certain parts of the county, that if you were placed in the wrong voting district, it also meant you were placed in the wrong school board district, that you were voting for a school board district member who wasn't actually the member for you, where the district where your house physically was placed, which kind of negates the entire purpose of bringing litigation to ensure that voters can elect the candidate of their choice. And it can also be used nefariously to dilute voters out of kind of go back to the same old packing principle, where if you have a competitive school board district that is about 60% native, but you have a neighboring district that's about 80% native, arguably county elections officials could use the ambiguity caused by the lack of addresses to dilute the power of the native vote in the 60% district and pack it into the 90% or 80% district. That's a lot of background. I realize I kind of went on a lot there, but this is an important issue. And instead of just calling it out, RUP worked to create a solution, which I'm going to get to in a little bit here. In 2018, though, as the election neared, we switched from voter registration to get out the vote mode. We implemented a lot of tactics, rise to the polls, voter protection. We were able to work with the Utah State Bar Association and some others to bring in some legal poll watchers to observe the polling locations for the same sorts of issues we saw in the primary. And we did conventional kind of text and phone banking and mail and radio advertising and canvassing that you would expect to see with a voter or a Get Out the Vote program in just about any part of the country. And the work paid off. Voter turnout was the highest ever on the Navajo Nation in a midterm election, actually the highest ever in any election, and the voter turnout countywide was the highest ever recorded in a midterm election at 75%, which was a really exciting result to see. And the increase in voter turnout most likely resulted in the victory of Willie Gray Eyes, who, along with Kenneth Maryboy, elected out of District 3, were elected to serve as the first ever majority Native County Commission in San Juan County's history. And here you can see Commissioner Gray Eyes and Commissioner Maryboy being sworn in alongside Commissioner Bruce Adams and County Clerk John David Nielsen and County Assessor Greg Adams there back in January of 2019. I'm not going to go off on the side note, but this was actually the same day that Willie Gray Eyes was served with court papers as his challenger kind of filed a sore loser lawsuit, bringing up some of the same old claims that were used, and Maya alluded to try to keep Commissioner Gray Eyes from getting onto the election ballot in 2018 to begin with. But it was a happy day nonetheless to see history being made in San Juan County. And since then, and this slide hasn't really been updated, the county commission really got busy. First of all, they officially voted to withdraw the county from a lot of really expensive public lands litigation. The previous commission had really dug the county into a financial hole getting involved in all sorts of really pricey ideological public lands litigation. Maybe even more importantly, though, the new county commission majority got to work kind of implementing some typical policies and procedures for the county commission and how the county commission operated that you would expect from any county commission, but San Juan County had never really taken steps. For example, passing a policies and procedures manual for the commission itself, attempting to move the actual location of the meetings, the county commission meetings, around the county, so that in the largest geographical county in Utah, individual residents from Blanding and from Navajo Mountain and from Oljeto and from Aneth would all have at least some opportunity to get to these meetings in person, as opposed to having to take a Tuesday morning off to drive up to Monticello. And so there was a lot of big momentum shifts that happened. Of course, it didn't come without quite a bit of consternation and frustration from county staff and others, but the county commission was able to accomplish a lot immediately after in that first year of being elected. I know that this is kind of a disjointed transition, and I realize that we might be running up on time here, but I wanted to take a second to talk a little bit more about that street address problem, because Rural Utah Project has taken a lot of steps. We actually took some in 2018 and have taken a lot since to try to address this issue, not just for the purposes of ensuring people are placed in the correct voting precincts, but also as a more holistic solution, ideally trying to get folks more access to services that you would expect, like EMS, fire, maybe someday package delivery. We talked about how there are about 2,300 homes on the Navajo Nation in Utah, and as of 2018, none of them had a typical conventional street address, a named road, and then a house number. And so we actually, through some partners at the Navajo Nation, learned about this technology called Plus Codes, which is an open source digital addressing solution that it was developed by Google engineers back, and it was actually developed essentially to be implemented in parts of the world, mostly in the developing world, where streets are not named and houses don't have numbers. And the Navajo Nation Addressing Authority, a guy named MC Baldwin, cued us into this technology in 2018 because essentially a plus code is just a shortened version of latitude and longitude. It was really easy to write these codes onto voter registration forms so that the county clerk could accurately place voters in precincts when we turn those forms in. After 2018, though, we kind of got to thinking and talking with some of the local Navajo chapters here about applications for these codes outside the voting context, beyond the voting context. And that was the impetus of our rural addressing program. And I will play a video.
To the east is U Mountain. To the west is Monument Valley. All areas have Navajo names. All the meadows have names, all the rocks, but we don't have street names.
The Navajo Nation is over 27,000 square miles. It covers 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The Navajo Nation currently doesn't have a lot of street addresses.
It's like past this rock or the Y in a road. That's how we direct people, just using landmarks and guessing on mileage.
We will ask dispatch to ask them that if they see us, they start honking their horn, or have the family members come out and meet us on the road, take us into the house. That saves us a lot of time.
So about 6 years ago, I was working on a project to detect new roads that we didn't have in our maps. We have great imagery from satellites, so adding these towns to our maps from the GPS coordinates just seemed like a really easy thing to do.
I was attending a Google conference. One of the presentations was plus codes.
I was talking about working in Kolkata to assign plus codes in the city so that people have an address that they can use to get bank accounts and access to benefits.
Instantly, we knew this is it. This is the solution we need. We started talking with Doug, and he came out to the Navajo Nation, and that's where we started the collaboration.
A plus code is just a reference to a location based on a GPS coordinate. Just go to Google Maps and tap the blue dot, and we'll display the plus code.
Go out in the middle of nowhere, and anywhere you stand, you have a plus code. And that's what we're giving out to the community to address them.
We're still learning about what works, what changes we can make to just make it easier for people to discover the codes and for them to use it. One of the most challenging problems that they expressed to me is emergency response time, especially ambulances getting to homes.
We had several traumatic runs where we didn't know the address and we had not been able to get to the person in time to help save their life. Had we gotten there sooner, possibly we could have saved them.
The experience I had with my mom, we couldn't get an ambulance out to where we live. So my mom lost a whole hour when she had a stroke. I wouldn't want anybody to go through that.
While we're traveling to get in here, it could already be importing the information we pull out and it's there.
A lot of people are excited about using plus codes, what the possibilities are.
If dispatch could just say, look at the number on the house and tell me what that number is, problem solved.
My son put up a plus code on social media to inform people of where a ceremony is going to take place. We had people from everywhere, the middle of Arizona, the other end of the reservation, show up.
We've heard of small businesses like a jeweler that publish their location using a plus code so that people can find them and they grow their business.
It's basically what we've been looking for, something easy to use and it's available for everyone.
Ultimately, our hope is to help them solve the problems that they face locally, not just the ones that we think that they face, and allow them to access the same kind of benefits that a lot of us just take for granted as an effect of having an address.
I want my people to be visible. Navajos are residents of the state of Utah. This is our home.
And we'll go back quickly to presentation mode. Kind of gives a background of the concept and the project of the plus codes. We are in the phase now of actually distributing signs that have these codes to every house on the Navajo Nation in Utah. And we're in the process of working with entities to try to increase the number of organizations that will recognize those plus codes to be used kind of like in place of a traditional street address. And so we're expecting to have completed delivery of all of these signs to homes across the Utah Strip of the Navajo Nation by the end of this year. And we are optimistic that we can find kind of creative new ways to show how these codes can be used. So That's kind of a little more about our addressing program, and that'll kind of wrap up my section of the presentation. I really appreciate you bearing with me through it. I know we covered a lot of ground, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. We are always looking for support, and we love folks who are willing to volunteer and help us out. So I'll leave this kind of slide up, and maybe I can take questions at this point.
Okay, Karen or Kathy, do you see any questions? I see a couple there. I put one in.
I'll go first. Drew, does the U.S. Postal Service recognize plus codes?
No, they don't. And, you know, unfortunately, it's unlikely unless there's a large kind of bureaucratic shift within the Postal Service that they will ever recognize plus codes. That said, the nice thing about plus codes in our mind is that it's an open source tool that coordinates exactly to latitude and longitudinal coordinates. So it actually will make it'll make the process of doing normal conventional street addressing at a point when the funding becomes available a lot easier. Once you know where all the houses are, you can kind of do a better feasibility study for conducting conventional street addressing. And, you know, unfortunately, even places on Navajo Nation and other parts of Navajo Nation that do have conventional street addresses, we've seen that kind of the systematic defunding of the Postal Service has resulted in a lot of rural areas not getting postal delivery, home postal delivery, even after conventional street addresses. But to answer your question, no, currently not.
Wow, thank you.
The next question was mine. I wonder if Colorado uses them, and then Bev asked, does voter registration recognize the plus codes? So the part about if Colorado uses them made me think of other tribes. I mean, you're focusing on the Navajo there because that's who's the tribe that's there, but
Sure.
do you know much about the rest of the thing?
So to answer your question on other indigenous nations, as of now, I know that the White Mountain Apache Nation in Arizona has taken some steps to utilize plus codes for a variety of purposes, for, you know, kind of internal service provision in their tribal government. I don't know of any nations, you know, I don't believe that White Mountain or that Ute Mountain in Toyac, or that the Southern Ute tribe, to my knowledge, uses plus codes. And in fact, they might not have the same need to if there's conventional street addresses already there. As far as states go, it's actually pretty cool. Arizona became the first state, I think 2 years ago now, to write just a really simple computer program, software program that can convert plus codes to latitude and longitude. It's an open source piece of software, and they were able to build that into their voter registration portal so that county elections officials could just type plus codes in place of typical conventional street addresses, and the voter would be geocoded to the correct precinct. I've also presented at the at the Montana State Legislature to their committee, Tribal Affairs Subcommittee, and I know that there was some momentum there to utilize plus codes to solve some of these same sorts of voter placement and EMS, emergency services issues.
There's another question about the fact that in a lot of rural areas in other parts of the world, it's a problem. And I know that gentleman that on that video you showed mentioned Calcutta in India. Do you know if the plus system is being applied to other countries, like areas in South America where they have large rural environments?
South America, I don't. Off the top of my head, I know that in Calcutta, India, and a variety of other places.
Go to another room. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I know that in Calcutta, they're actually being used for the purpose of mail delivery, and they're kind of like the official governmental addresses that could be used to get official government ID. I know that the International Rescue Committee has used them in Somalia for public health vaccine distribution. And I know if you go to plus.codes, that website, it will take you to a web page that kind of gives some examples of how they're being used around the world. I will say plus codes are kind of nice because they're totally free. Anybody can figure out what their plus code is. And in fact, you can figure out what your plus code is without having internet connection. The easiest way is to go to Google Maps and drop the pin. But you can actually go in an offline when you're out in the middle of nowhere, or you throw your plane in, or your phone into airplane mode. You can find your plus code using the Google Maps app, and it's nice because no company owns the technology that converts the latitude and longitude to the plus code. It's essentially just like a math equation, and so. It's kind of nice to have a decentralized open source solution to this issue that essentially is latitude and longitude, but a lot shorter and a lot easier to remember. So I'd imagine that there'll probably be an uptick of nations using these plus codes in place of conventional street addresses down the road.
Thank you.
The next question is, if voter registration doesn't recognize plus codes, what about legal description lot numbers? And I think you're talking about like county tax records. Is that a?
Well, of course, the county doesn't assess and doesn't have legal jurisdiction to assess or tax property on the Navajo Nation or any sovereign nation. So there are no, county recorded legal lot numbers for residences on the Navajo Nation. There are, however, home site leases. The Navajo Nation Department of Lands holds a lot of information regarding the placement of homes and the kind of legal lease owners of various parcels of land. Unfortunately, those aren't very accessible, and there's not really a sharing policy between the Navajo Nation. I mean, that's pretty private information to give to the county for voter registration purposes, and a lot of them, the older versions of those documents don't really clearly define where the house is located on the parcel itself. So, it's definitely it's an idea, and I see where you're coming from. It can work, though. I mean, I think that more communication between the assessor's office and the clerk's office, the elections office, when it comes to like where I live in Bluff, where we do have conventional street addresses, and of course we have official county, property, surveyed property boundaries, but the clerk, the street addresses don't always, when you type them into the computer, they don't always geocode to a specific location on the map. So it could be helpful in that case. That's a good suggestion.
Oh, Karen, I've kind of lost track of where we are. Do you want to take the next one?
Yeah. Mary Dodd has put in a lot of great information, and I think I can read it, or I can ask Mary Dodd to just talk because she's been doing this. And then the next question would be Ellis about gerrymandering. So Mary Dodd, can you talk to us about?
Sure. First of all, thank you, the La Plata County Dems, for putting this on. The Montezuma County Dems appreciate it, and San Juan County, Utah is our next door neighbor to the west. So during 2018, I did a lot of canvassing in Toyac, and I think one of the most important outcomes of working with the county clerk during that midterm election was to get a permanent ballot box outside of the tribal offices in Toyac. And granted, it's a much smaller reservation than the Navajo reservation, but nevertheless, having people be able to drop their ballot right there, and for all elections that are both, they use it for tribal elections as well, Addressing is still a problem. We found that when we canvassed, we went with a tribal police officer, and that was because he knew everybody, and also was big enough to scare the res dogs away. And just one other thing about canvassing on the reservation, I got to carrying a little bag of kibble so that I could throw the kibble at the dogs so that I could get up to an address. But that's really all I have to share. But this is a fascinating project, and thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if we've really addressed the issue of voter purges, registration purging. Is that still going on, Drew?
We
By
do.
the county clerk?
We do monitor it, and we have not seen a purge event similar to what we saw in 2018 and earlier, thankfully. But there's still, unfortunately, Utah gives a lot of leeway to clerks to move voters to inactive after just missing 2 elections, and so we have seen kind of natural purging of voters who have a period of inactivity, but we haven't seen like a large purge event like the one that Maya describes.
If I could add something to that quickly, Utah county clerks have an immense amount of power in general in Utah, and they wield that power, and make a lot of unilateral decisions. Another aspect of voter suppression that I witnessed when I worked in San Juan County is the county clerk was in charge of signature matching and would reject, piles and piles of predominantly Navajo ballots on the basis of mismatched signatures without any formal training. And we have photos of this from the early, I guess 2012, 2014 elections. These very insidious and often overlooked aspects of the voter ballot process and how that translates to voter suppression. Thanks for letting me jump in.
That's a great point, Maya. And I mean, there are just so many ways that counties can act to either make voting really accessible, broadly accessible, or really restrict people's access. And the signature matching is a great example of a lot of elders here in San Juan County will actually use their fingerprint, their thumbprint as an official signature. But of course, county clerks and their staff are not exactly trained on how to handle that. And in San Juan County, they've used that kind of ambiguity to throw out ballots before. And so I think that we continue to monitor, and actually with a signature matching problem, we're actually working with the ACLU of Utah on a bill that would kind of provide some in-state code legal requirements for how county officials have to handle the signature matching process so that it doesn't become an avenue for arbitrary kind of voter discrimination like it can be used now.
All right, then someone asked, let's see, where was up there? Beth asked, what percentage of COVID vax are in San Juan County? And I looked it up, and just yesterday it said 42% have gotten 1 dose. I guess those are adults. But do you have any other information?
I know that there's a large disparity between the vaccination percentages on the Navajo Nation and in Monticello and Blanding in the northern edge of the county. I was very fortunate. We all are. I get my healthcare through the Utah Navajo Health System, and we had vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, available basically to anybody over the age of 18 who wanted it, starting I think all the way back in February of this year. The Utah Navajo Health System was amazing at getting that vaccine out to people. So we kind of really early hit that point where it wasn't a supply problem, it was a demand issue that kind of kept the vaccination percentage a little low. And we're seeing an uptick in cases again on the northern edge of the county, primarily amongst unvaccinated folks. And I know Western Colorado, I was reading Grand Junction, the hospitals were pretty full in the weeks leading up to 4th of July because of the unvaccinated population and the Delta variant. So it's I know that Utah Navajo Health System did a really great job rolling out the vaccine to those who wanted it here.
I have a question. If the voting right legislation ever gets through the U.S. Congress, what would be the impact at the local level, since states seem to have most of the voting rights attributed to them, and then pursuant to the conversation we've had, the county clerks have so much authority and power. Will it really impact what they will be able to do or not do?
The short answer is yes. And I would, the Federal Voting Rights Act gave, the initial incarnation of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave, there were a lot of built-in protections that kind of removed power from some of the bad actors at the local and state levels that were, attempting to deny people the right to vote based on race. The chief among those provisions was the pre-clearance provision, that actually, if you were a county or city and you wanted to change your voting, anything related to voting access, where polling locations are, et cetera, you actually had to be pre-cleared. That change had to be run by the Federal Department of Justice or a court before you could make that change. Now that was gutted. That provision was gutted, of course, in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013. There is a really amazing piece of legislation, and I'm trying to remember the exact number here, pull it up. The Native American Voting Rights Act, the Frank Harrison, Elizabeth Peratrovich, and Miguel Trujillo Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021, which is would be a fantastic step towards solving some of these issues we've talked about today. It does things like requiring elections officials to accept tribal identification cards. It would actually require that local subdivisions that control voting consult with Indigenous nations. I think that that's probably the biggest in my mind, is if San Juan County, before they made changes to where polling locations were located or how they were registering voters, actually had to talk to the Navajo Nation and to the Ute Mountain Ute Nation, a lot of issues could be avoided. And so, and of course, this piece of legislation goes a lot further than that, but it would require a ballot drop box or early voting option in each precinct that it covers any tribal lands. And so if you want more information, I'm happy to send a follow-up on that, but that would be a great example of legislation that would make a huge difference for voting access. And I know that there of course is the kind of voting omnibus bill, the John L. Lewis Act, and I think that that accomplishes a lot of these same goals.
I guess we just don't know if that's going to make it through.
Yeah, right. I'll try not to get into politics.
Could we ask about the ballot curing? There's a question about were there a large number of ballot cures, and Maya said there's very little, at least in the past, because the county is so vast, it's difficult to cure ballots and get in touch with voters whose ballots were rejected. So
Maya hit it on the head. I mean, it is so difficult. And Utah has a really small curing window, especially when it comes to the signature, ballots lacking signature. And so, I mean, I remember in 2018, on election night of 2018, I was at the Monument Valley polling location, and I had to drive 30 miles up to an old area called the VCA, which is by one of the big old uranium mines up to the northeast, and try to find a resident. And of course, this was pre-plus code, so it was really hard to kind of find where this person even lived. She was older, and just curing her one ballot that lacked a signature took about an hour and a half. So if you imagine trying to do that at a large scale, it's just impossible.
you're going to get the rest, Kathy, or shall I get it?
Let's see. Someone writes, could you please include, excuse me, With regard to gerrymandering, what suggestions could you give those in CD3 with regard to upcoming public hearings on redistricting maps?
That's a really good question, and something that we're working on. So in Utah, there is, for the first time ever, a state level independent redistricting commission. Of course, the legislature kind of gutted the authority of that commission, but they can only recommend maps for state districts and congressional districts. In Utah, like when it comes to most things, Utah gives a lot of deference to counties, and San Juan County is one of only a few counties in Utah that actually has single member districts for the county commission. So they're one of the few counties that's undergoing a redistricting process this year. The commission just a few weeks ago took a big step, I think, in a positive direction. They've retained the expert they've retained a redistricting consultant who was the Navajo Nation's expert in the racial gerrymandering litigation. And so that expert, that consultant, will be providing advice once the new census data is released on what sorts of if the maps need to be tweaked, and giving the commission some options of different maps that would be compliant with the Voting Rights Act, and so that the county could avoid litigation like the litigation we talked about today in the future. And as far as giving suggestions to those and to folks in the third commission district on upcoming public hearings, I think that one good step now would be to write the commission, and particularly Commissioner Kenneth Maryboy, and really explain or ask that the county hold public hearings and hold in-person public hearings when it comes to redistricting, and also that the county in those public hearings take steps to ensure that Navajo language interpretive services are provided so that folks can actually fully participate in those hearings. I would also, as far as CD3 goes, it's important, just like with redistricting anywhere, to really articulate how you feel your community of interest is formed. And I know in Commission District 3, it makes a lot of sense to keep Bluff and Montezuma Creek together, since there's a lot of kind of traveling back and forth that happens, and a lot of folks kind of view it as a more holistic community as opposed to two distinct communities, but really being able to articulate what your community of interest is. And RUP is going to be doing a lot of work to try to help folks as they're mapping their communities of interest and asking for fair maps for the county commission and school board districts in 2020 here in 2021 for the next 2022 elections.
Okay, thank you.
I want to make sure you put your information in the chat, Drew. Someone asked if you could include your email. And as you're typing, for those on phones or whatever, if you could, it's drew@ruralutah.org.
Yep. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have or connect independently after the fact. And you can go to ruralutah.org to find more information about RUP, and also you can find our contact information there.
Okay, I think that's the last of the questions. This is obviously something that is a huge problem in San Juan County, Utah, but it's also a problem in many parts of the U.S. where different groups are trying to disenfranchise voters, not that they've already disenfranchised them like you're trying to overcome, but where they're trying to take away voting rights. So I think it's important that anyone who cares about this, which I would assume is everybody that's on this call, reach out to people in positions where they can do something about it, and make it clear that voting is the fundamental right in a democracy. So do we have any other questions for Drew or for Maya? Anyone?
I don't see anything. Everybody was very impressed with the presentation, however.
Yep. Did we have any other announcements?
Yeah, I want to
Karen?
announce that on Saturday, August 9th, wait a minute, let me make sure. Saturday, that we attend our local redistricting meeting. Is it
August 7th.
August 7th? Okay, August 7th. And all the email that we got, it just said AM. So I blocked out 8 to noon because the time and location in Ignacio will be provided through the DIMS. And Gwen, I'm not sure what should we do before showing up there? Should we write a statement or send one in? Or?
Well, I think there's some effort going on right now to try to put together a small group of people to talk about how we might affect that process. I mean, you can't just go there and say, hey, we don't like your map, because there's too many Republicans in there. You have to, meet specific criteria. So we're gonna, I can't remember if it's Ann Markwood or somebody is sort of leading that effort. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, let me know or let Ann know. And we can see what we can do. I did see an article today in Colorado Politics that said that the commissions are trying to get the state Supreme Court to let them push the timelines out a little bit beyond what's in the constitutional amendments. And they're even thinking about cutting back some of the public meetings just because of the fact that they don't have much time. So we'll just have to stay on top of this and see where things go from here.
Gwen, this is Mary. The Colorado Democratic Party is actually doing some trainings on how to best make comment. And they're also going to be having regular meetings on Tuesdays for party chairs and vice chairs on the same thing about how best to go about it. So just an FYI that training will be available fairly soon here.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, I talked to Barbara McLaughlin was it last weekend, and she said that new district that she would be in was terrible because it picks up, it drops a lot of the Democratic areas to the north and adds Montezuma County, Mary, or at least the eastern half of Montezuma County. So this is something that we do need to stay on top of and try to influence things so that we don't end up with more Boberts. Excuse me for being political.
Is there a deadline for having the redistricting completed?
Yes, there are deadlines that are specified in the 2 constitutional amendments that were passed. And that's where there's a problem because the commissions, because of the fact that the census data is late, the commissions are not convinced that they can do fair redistricting within that time frame. So again, that's something we just got to keep an eye on. Okay, let's give a virtual round of applause to Drew and thank him for participating in our luncheon today. I think that was absolutely great. So we appreciate it. And obviously you have contact information, and if there's things that you think you can do to help out the Rural Utah Project, definitely get involved. So thanks everybody. And next month we'll have Phil Weiser, and I think he'll be very interesting. Did you have something else, Drew?
No, I just wanted to say thanks everyone. It was really cool to get the opportunity to present to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everybody, and we'll have the recording available here shortly. I know there were some people that wanted to attend and couldn't, but I think it'd be well worth their while to watch the recording. So thanks a lot, and everybody have a rest of a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.